The small town of Willow Creek, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, was known for its quiet charm and timeless traditions. Every year, the townsfolk gathered for the highlight of the season, the Willow Creek Barn Dance. It wasn't just a night of music and laughter, it was an unspoken symbol of community and resilience. Farmers, ranchers, and families from miles around made their way to the old Henderson barn, dressed in their best boots and hats, ready to celebrate the fruits of their labor and the bonds that held them together. The barn itself was a sight to behold, adorned with twinkling string lights that crisscrossed overhead, illuminating the rustic beams and giving the place a warm glow. The air was filled with the hum of laughter and the rich aroma of grilled meats and fresh pies, which lingered along with the occasional echo of boots tapping against the wooden dance floor. The band was in full swing, fiddles and guitars blending harmoniously with the rhythmic clapping of the crowd as couples danced in synchronized joy. Outside, cars and pickups lined the dirt road, their headlights casting soft beams across the fields where fireflies danced in the tall grass. Claire Dalton, 22 years old and full of life, moved gracefully through the crowd with an armful of lemonade pitchers, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid that swayed as she walked. She was the unofficial heart of the event, helping her family keep everything running smoothly. Her laugh was infectious, her smile warm and genuine, and it was clear she thrived in these moments of connection. The Daltons were well known in Willow Creek, and Claire's father, Tom, had spent decades building their modest farm from the ground up. For the Daltons, the barn dance wasn't just tradition, it was personal. It was a reminder that even in a tough world, there was always room for joy. As Claire worked, her uncle Jack Reynolds lingered in the shadows of the barn's back corner. Jack had only recently returned to Willow Creek, and though the town greeted him with open arms, he had remained an enigmatic figure. In his early 50s, Jack's weathered face told stories he never shared, and his piercing blue eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. For nearly 2 decades, Jack had served as a Marine raider, operating in some of the world's most hostile environments. But after leaving the service, he had chosen a quieter life, drifting between odd jobs and long bouts of solitude. His return to Willow Creek had surprised even his sister, Tom's wife, who had always assumed Jack would wander forever. Jack stood apart from the revelry, a silent observer with a cigarette burning low between his fingers. Dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, he looked every bit the rugged drifter, though his military posture betrayed a precision he couldn't shake. He didn't need to be in the thick of the action to feel the pulse of the event. His keen eyes picked up every detail, the playful flirtations on the dance floor, the shy glances exchanged between teenagers, the way Tom slapped his old friend Joe on the back as they shared a joke near the grill. Jack watched it all with a quiet appreciation, his heart caught between the peace of the moment and the gnawing instinct that had kept him alive for years. Peace was always fleeting. The night carried on without a hitch until the faint rumble of engines cut through the music. At first it was barely noticeable, blending with the sound of the band, but as the noise grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. Heads turned toward the barn's open doors, where a row of motorcycles appeared, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The engines snarled like predators as the riders dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel as they approached the barn. The band faltered, the music slowing to an awkward halt, and a heavy silence fell over the crowd. The group of bikers was led by a man who exuded menace with every step. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his leather jacket adorned with patches bearing the name Iron Fangs and a snarling wolf emblem. His head was shaved clean, save for a jagged scar that ran across his temple, and his dark eyes scanned the barn like a hunter sizing up prey. Behind him, his crew fanned out 10 men, each as rough-looking as the last. The Iron Fangs went from Willow Creek, they were outsiders, and their arrival sent an icy ripple through the warm night. The leader stopped in the barn's entrance, his silhouette cutting a foreboding figure against the soft light. He surveyed the scene with a smirk, as though the festive atmosphere was a personal affront. His gaze landed on Claire, and he took a deliberate step forward, the crowd parting instinctively as he moved. "Looks like we found ourselves a little party," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't mind us. We're just here to enjoy the amenities." Claire stiffened, clutching the pitcher in her hands as her father stepped protectively beside her. Tom's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "This is a private event," he said evenly. "We don't want any trouble." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo in the silence. "Trouble? We're just here to make friends. Isn't that right, boys?" His crew chuckled darkly, spreading out through the barn and making a show of examining the food, the drinks, and the people. One of them knocked over a stack of plates, and the crash made a few people jump. Jack watched from his corner, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved since the bikers arrived, but his eyes were fixed on the scene, tracking every movement with the precision of a sniper. He noticed the way the leader carried himself, the casual confidence of a man who thrived on intimidation. Jack's gaze shifted to his crew, noting their positioning, the way they communicated with subtle gestures. These weren't just random thugs. They were coordinated, dangerous, and they were here for more than just mischief. The leader's attention returned to Claire, his smile predatory. "How about a drink, sweetheart? You look like you could use some company." Tom stepped between them, his voice firm. "Leave her alone." The man's smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. He took another step forward, towering over Tom. "I don't think you understand how this works, old man. We're not asking." Before Tom could respond, Jack's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You're done." It was calm, low, and utterly commanding. The kind of voice that made people stop and listen. All eyes turned to Jack as he stepped into the light, the cigarette still smouldering between his fingers. He moved with the deliberate confidence of someone who had nothing to prove but everything under control. The leader's gaze narrowed, sizing him up. "And who the hell are you?" Jack took one last drag from his cigarette, flicked it to the ground, and crushed it under his boot. "I'm the guy who's given you one chance to leave. Take it." The leader's crew shifted uneasily, sensing the change in the air. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. He smirked, gesturing to Jack's rugged appearance. "What you gonna do, farmer? Hit me with a pitchfork?" Jack didn't respond. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the leader's, unflinching. The silence stretched, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the barn. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm. And Jack, for all his calm, looked like a man who had weathered far worse. The tension in the barn hung heavy, like a taut rope ready to snap. The crowd had grown eerily quiet, their collective unease almost palpable. Jack stood motionless in the center of it all, his calm gaze locked on the leader of the Iron Fangs. The man, known to his crew as Crusher, sneered, the scar on his temple twisting grotesquely as his lips curled. Around them, the bikers began to spread out through the barn, their leather boots scuffing against the wooden floor, their movements slow but deliberate. It was clear they had done this before coming to a place like this, sow fear and take what they wanted. Crusher took another step toward Jack, his imposing figure looming larger with every step. "You must be one hell of a comedian," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Giving us an ultimatum? That's rich. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But you don't seem to get how this works." We're not the kind of guys you tell to leave. Behind Crusher, one of his men, a wiry, jittery guy with greasy hair, had already started rooting through the buffet table, shoving handfuls of food into his mouth with mock gusto. Another biker stood by the band, his fingers trailing over the strings of a fiddle, plucking at them hard enough to make the instrument screech. A few others had cornered a couple of young farmhands near the hay bales, laughing as they poked and prodded the frightened boys. Jack didn't so much as flinch. His hands hung loosely by his sides, relaxed but ready, his stance one of complete control. He didn't need to respond to Crusher's threats. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet, unwavering defiance that unsettled even the most hardened men in the room. Claire, who had been standing frozen beside her father, finally found her voice. "Leave," she said, her words sharp and clear despite the tremor in her tone. "You're not welcome here." Crusher's eyes flicked to her, his expression twisting into something ugly. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, sweetheart," he growled, taking a deliberate step in her direction. "But since you're so eager to speak up, maybe we can start with you." Tom immediately stepped in front of his daughter, his shoulders squared despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "That's enough," he said firmly. "You've made your point. Now get out of here before this gets any worse." Crusher laughed, the sound grating and humorless. "Worse? Oh, we're just getting started, old man." It happened so fast that most of the onlookers didn't even register the movement. Crusher lunged forward, shoving Tom hard enough to send him stumbling back into Claire, who barely managed to catch. In a flash, Jack closed the distance between himself and Crusher, his hand lashing out like a whip. He grabbed Crusher by the front of his leather jacket and yanked him forward, his other hand curling into a fist that stopped just short of the man's face. The movement was precise, controlled, a silent warning that Jack could end this before Crusher even had time to process what was happening. Crusher froze, his bravado faltering as he stared into Jack's eyes, cold, unflinching, and utterly lethal. For a moment, the entire barn seemed to hold its breath. "I said you're done," Jack repeated, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. He released Crusher with a shove, sending him staggering back a step. The bikers tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward the weapons strapped to their belts. But Jack didn't so much as glance their way. His attention remained solely on Crusher. "You think you're the first punk who's tried to throw his weight around in a place like this?" Jack said, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "Let me tell you something, kid. You're not nearly as scary as you think you are. Now, you can take your boys and leave, or you can find out just how bad of a mistake you've made tonight. Your call." For a moment, it looked like Crusher might back down. His crew was clearly uneasy, shifting on their feet as they exchanged glances. But then Crusher's pride kicked in, and his scowl deepened. He wasn't about to let some old man humiliate him in front of his crew. "You've got a death wish, old man," he snarled, reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Fine by me." Before the blade even cleared its sheath, Jack moved. He sidestepped Crusher's lunge with practiced ease, his hands a blur as he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, and Crusher let out a pained grunt as Jack's other hand slammed into his chest, sending him sprawling backward. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. The barn erupted into chaos. The bikers surged forward, their earlier hesitation replaced by a collective roar of anger. Jack met them head-on, his movements fluid and efficient. He ducked under a wild swing from one man, driving his elbow into the biker's ribs before pivoting to kick another squarely in the knee. A third came at him with a crowbar, but Jack caught the weapon mid-swing, wrenching it free and using it to knock the man off balance. It wasn't a brawl. It was a dismantling. Jack didn't waste a single motion, every strike calculated to incapacitate without unnecessary brutality. The bikers, for all their numbers and bravado, were no match for the sheer precision of a man who had spent decades mastering the art of combat. But Jack wasn't the only one moving. Claire, her initial fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed a broom handle and used it to jab at one of the bikers who had cornered her father. Tom, though winded from the earlier shove, swung a chair at another, forcing him to retreat. Even a few of the other townsfolk began to fight back, emboldened by Jack's example. Within minutes, the bikers were either down or retreating, their confidence shattered. Crusher, nursing a bruised ego and an injured wrist, scrambled to his feet and glared at Jack with pure venom. "You've made a big mistake," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You think this is over? We're coming back. And when we do, you'll wish you'd stayed out of our way." Jack didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their bravado replaced by seething humiliation. The roar of their engines filled the night as they sped off into the darkness, leaving behind a barn full of shaken but determined townsfolk. As the noise faded, Jack turned to face the crowd. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a warning. "They'll be back," he said simply. "And when they come, they'll bring more. We need to be ready." The barn was silent for a moment before Claire stepped forward, her hands still gripping the makeshift weapon she had used to defend her father. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear lingering in her eyes. Jack's gaze softened as he looked at his niece. "We fight smart," he said, "and we fight together." With that, he turned and walked toward the barn's back entrance, his mind already racing with plans. This wasn't the first time Jack Reynolds had faced overwhelming odds, but for the first time in years, the stakes were personal. This wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting the people he loved and showing the Iron Fangs what happened when they picked the wrong fight. The barn was quiet now, save for the faint creak of its old wooden beams and the murmured voices of the townsfolk gathering their wits. The Iron Fangs were gone, their roaring engines fading into the distance like an ominous promise. But the tension they left behind lingered, heavy and oppressive. Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of the barn, his arms crossed as he stared out into the darkness. His mind was already working, scanning through decades of experience, trying to anticipate the next move. He knew they'd be back. Men like Crusher didn't take humiliation lightly, and the way Jack had dismantled his crew tonight wasn't something the gang leader would let go unanswered. No, Crusher would return, and he'd come with more men, more weapons, and a thirst for revenge. Jack wasn't afraid of them, not for himself, but he'd seen enough violence to know that when men like the Iron Fangs came back, it wasn't just one or two people who got hurt. Entire communities could be torn apart. Behind him, Claire approached cautiously, her face pale but resolute. She'd barely had time to process what had happened, but she wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. "Uncle Jack," she said quietly, "what are we going to do? They're not going to just let this go, are they?" Jack turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "No," he admitted. "They won't. Men like that, they don't back down. Not after what happened tonight. They'll come back, and they'll come back angry." Her hands clenched at her sides, but she held his gaze. "So what do we do? Call the sheriff? Get help?" Jack shook his head. "The sheriff won't be enough. If Crusher's smart, and I think he is, he's already got a hold on local law enforcement. Either that, or he's planning to overwhelm them before they can do much of anything. No, Claire, we can't rely on anyone else to handle this for us. We're going to have to take care of it ourselves. Claire swallowed hard, her fear evident but tempered by determination. How? We're farmers, not soldiers. We don't have weapons, training, anything. Jack placed a steady hand on her shoulder. You don't need to be soldiers to protect what's yours. I've seen plenty of ordinary people do extraordinary things when their backs were against the wall. And trust me, we've got more resources than you think. We just have to use them right. Tom approached, his face lined with worry but also resolve. Jack, he said, his voice low, if you've got a plan, you'd better tell us. People are scared. We need to know what we're up against. Jack nodded, gesturing for Tom and Claire to follow him. First things first, he said. We need to know what we're dealing with. These guys aren't just some rowdy bikers out for a good time. They're organized, coordinated, and dangerous. That means they've got a plan, and if we're going to stop them, we need to figure out what it is. He led them out of the barn and toward the old equipment shed on the edge of the property. Inside, the dim light from a single bulb illuminated a cluttered workspace filled with tools, spare parts, and odds and ends that hadn't been used in years. Jack immediately began rummaging through the piles, pulling out anything he deemed useful: chains, steel cables, even an old hunting trap. Jack, Tom said hesitantly, what are you thinking? Jack glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim but focused. We're going to fortify this place, turn it into something they won't see coming. If they want to come back here, we'll make sure they regret it. Tom frowned, clearly uneasy. You're talking about fighting them. I'm talking about defending ourselves, Jack corrected. They're coming back, Tom. That's not a question. The question is whether we're going to be ready for them when they do. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. What do you need us to do? Jack gave her a small, approving nod. First, we need to get everyone on the same page. The whole town is at risk here, not just the farm. If the Iron Fangs take over, they'll squeeze everyone for every penny they've got. We need to let people know what's coming and get them involved. This isn't something we can handle alone. Tom hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right, I'll talk to the others, see who's willing to help. Good, Jack said. And while you're doing that, I'll start working on the defenses. We don't have much time, so we're going to have to get creative. For the next several hours, Jack worked tirelessly, setting up the first stages of what would become a makeshift fortress. He started by reinforcing the barn itself, using steel cables to secure the doors and windows. He rigged the entrance with a tripwire connected to an old air horn, a crude but effective alarm system that would alert them to any intruders. He also repurposed several pieces of farm equipment, turning them into improvised barricades that could be used to block off key areas. As he worked, more and more townsfolk began to arrive, drawn by the whispers of what had happened at the barn dance. Some came out of curiosity, others out of concern, but all of them were united by a shared fear of what the Iron Fangs might do next. Among them were a few familiar faces, men and women who had served in the military, just like Jack, and who immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. One of them, a burly man named Bill Henderson, stepped forward and clapped Jack on the shoulder. Heard you had a little run-in with Crusher and his boys, he said, his tone half joking but his eyes sharp with understanding. Need an extra set of hands. Jack grinned faintly. You offering? Always, Bill replied. You think I'm going to sit by and let those bastards take over my hometown? Not a chance. Over the next several hours, the farm transformed into a hive of activity. Jack directed the townsfolk like a seasoned commander, assigning tasks and delegating responsibilities with an efficiency that left no room for argument. Some worked on reinforcing the perimeter, setting up barriers and clearing sightlines around the property. Others gathered supplies, everything from canned food and water to medical kits and spare tools. Jack even sent a few of the younger, more tech-savvy volunteers into town to gather information on the Iron Fangs, hoping to gain any intel that might give them an edge. As the sun began to rise, the farm looked less like a peaceful homestead and more like a defensive stronghold. The barn had been fortified with heavy planks and steel reinforcements, while the surrounding fields were dotted with hidden traps and obstacles designed to slow down or disable anyone who tried to cross them. Even the equipment shed had been turned into a makeshift command center, complete with maps, radios, and a growing arsenal of improvised weapons. But for all their progress, Jack knew they were still at a disadvantage. The Iron Fangs had numbers, weapons, and experience on their side, and while the townsfolk were willing to fight, most of them were farmers, not soldiers. They were brave, but bravery alone wouldn't be enough to win this fight. Jack stood on the porch of the farmhouse, surveying the scene as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon. His mind raced, calculating every possible scenario, every potential weakness in their defenses. He didn't like the odds, but he also knew there was no turning back now. The Iron Fangs were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted or until someone made them stop. Claire joined him on the porch, her face tired but determined. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll make it enough," he said firmly. "We don't have a choice." As they stood there, the distant sound of engines began to echo through the early morning air. Jack's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. It was starting. The Iron Fangs were coming, and the first test of their defenses was about to begin. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing Willow Creek in an eerie, amber glow. The morning seemed calm, but it was the kind of calm that preceded a storm. Jack Reynolds stood near the reinforced barn doors, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of the Dalton property. Everything about him was still, except for the ever-calculating flicker in his gaze. The quiet hum of the farm's newly installed generator buzzed in the background, providing power to the hastily set-up security lights and radios. The makeshift command center inside the equipment shed was alive with hushed voices and the rustling of maps as the townsfolk prepared for what felt inevitable. The preparations over the past 24 hours had been grueling, but they had turned the Dalton farm into a veritable fortress. The barn, the central hub of the defense, had been fortified with heavy wooden beams, steel cables, and strategically placed reinforcements. The surrounding fields had been riddled with traps, hidden trenches, crude but effective spike strips fashioned from farm tools, and even carefully rigged irrigation systems designed to create slick, muddy terrain to slow down incoming vehicles. Everyone had worked tirelessly under Jack's leadership, and while the exhaustion showed on their faces, so did a steely determination. Jack had divided the townsfolk into small teams, each assigned a specific role. Tom and Claire had been put in charge of logistics, ensuring supplies like food, water, and medical kits were distributed where needed. Bill Henderson, the ex-Marine turned mechanic, was overseeing the perimeter defenses, checking and rechecking the traps to ensure they would function when the time came. Even the younger volunteers had been given tasks, from running messages between teams to monitoring the radios for any signs of movement. But as ready as they were, the reality of what was coming loomed large. Jack knew the Iron Fangs wouldn't hold back this time. Crusher wasn't just looking to scare the Daltons into submission anymore, he was coming to settle a score. Jack's dismantling of Crusher and his men at the barn dance had been a humiliation the gang leader, couldn't afford to let stand. He'd return with numbers, with firepower, and with the intent to send a brutal message to anyone who dared oppose him. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of static from the radio on his hip. He unclipped it and held it to his ear. Bill's voice came through, low but urgent. "We've got movement on the east side, about a mile out. 3 bikes, moving slow. Looks like they're scouting." "Copy that," Jack replied, his tone steady. "Stay hidden and keep eyes on them. Don't engage unless they get too close." "Understood," Bill responded. Jack lowered the radio and turned to Claire, who had approached quietly, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "They're testing us," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Seeing what we've got, looking for weaknesses." Claire nodded, her hands clenched at her sides. "Do you think they'll attack today?" Jack's gaze flicked back to the tree line. "If I were Crusher, I'd hit us when we're most tired, when we're starting to think we might have a chance to relax. But we're not going to give him that opening." Claire followed his gaze, her stomach tightening as she imagined the chaos that was surely coming. She had grown up on this farm, and the thought of it becoming a battleground was almost too much to bear. But then she looked at Jack, his calm presence like an anchor in the storm, and she felt a spark of hope. If anyone could lead them through this, it was him. Hours passed, and the tension only grew. The scouting bikers circled the property, staying just far enough away to avoid detection by most of the townsfolk, but Jack and his team kept careful watch. It was clear the Iron Fangs were gathering information, probing for weaknesses, trying to determine the best point of attack. By midday, the scouts had retreated, disappearing back into the woods, and an uneasy silence fell over the farm. Inside the command center, Jack gathered the core group of defenders: Tom, Bill, Claire, and a few others who had stepped up as leaders. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and coffee as they crowded around a large map of the property spread out on a workbench. "They're watching us," Jack said, tapping the map with a calloused finger. "They're looking for blind spots, places where they can slip through without us noticing. We need to assume they'll come at us from multiple directions, and they'll do it fast and hard." Bill nodded, his expression grim. "They'll probably hit the main road first, try to blow through the gate and take out anyone in their way. If that doesn't work, they'll flank us through the fields." "That's what I'm counting on," Jack replied. "We've got traps set up on every major approach. The goal isn't to stop them outright, it's to slow them down, force them to split up, and make them vulnerable." Claire frowned, leaning over the map. "But what if they've got more men than we're expecting? Or heavier weapons? We can't exactly fight them head-on." Jack met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "That's why we're not going to fight them on their terms. They'll come in thinking they can overpower us, but we're going to make them fight for every inch. And by the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." The group nodded, their resolve hardening. They knew the odds were against them, but Jack's confidence was contagious. If he believed they could win, then so did they. By late afternoon, the first real sign of trouble appeared. A column of dust rose on the horizon, accompanied by the faint rumble of engines. Jack climbed to the top of the barn, his binoculars trained on the approaching vehicles. What he saw confirmed his worst fears: a convoy of motorcycles and trucks, at least 20 strong, barreling down the main road toward the farm. He climbed back down and called the team together. "They're coming," he said simply. "Everyone to your positions. Stick to the plan, and no matter what happens, keep moving. If you see someone in trouble, help them, but don't get pinned down. We've got one shot at this, and we need to make it count." The defenders scattered, each rushing to their assigned stations. Jack moved to the front line, where Bill and a few others had set up a barricade near the gate. They crouched behind stacks of hay bales and reinforced fences, their makeshift weapons at the ready. The rumble of engines grew louder, the ground trembling as the convoy drew closer. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady as he gripped the rifle he had taken from the equipment shed. He glanced at Bill, who gave him a tight nod. Then the Iron Fangs were upon them. The lead biker, a burly man with a bandana and mirrored sunglasses, gunned his engine and charged toward the gate. But as soon as his front tire hit the hidden spike strip, his bike lurched violently, sending him flying over the handlebars. He hit the ground hard, groaning in pain as the other bikers skidded to a halt behind him. Chaos erupted. The defenders sprang into action, triggering traps and launching a barrage of makeshift projectiles. One of the irrigation systems activated, spraying water across the field and turning the dirt into a slick, muddy mess that sent several bikers sliding out of control. In the confusion, Jack and Bill opened fire, their shots carefully aimed to disable vehicles and scatter the attackers. But the Iron Fangs weren't so easily deterred. Crusher himself appeared at the rear of the convoy, standing in the bed of a pickup truck, armed with a mounted spotlight. "Keep moving, you idiots," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Push through." The bikers regrouped, their numbers and firepower beginning to overwhelm the defenders. Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he adjusted the plan on the fly. "Fall back to the barn," he shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. "Regroup and hold the line." The defenders retreated in an organized scramble, covering each other as they moved back toward the barn. Jack stayed at the rear, his rifle barking as he provided cover fire. By the time they reached the barn, the bikers were closing in, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves on the hunt. But Jack wasn't done yet. As the first wave of attackers reached the barnyard, they tripped another set of traps this time, a series of hidden tripwires connected to smoke grenades. Thick clouds of smoke billowed out, blinding and disorienting the bikers as the defenders regrouped inside the barn. For the next hour, the battle raged on, a chaotic mix of gunfire, shouts, and the deafening roar of engines. The defenders fought with everything they had, using their knowledge of the terrain and their makeshift defenses to hold off the relentless assault. By the time the dust settled, the Iron Fangs had been driven back, their numbers decimated. Crusher and a handful of his men had managed to retreat, but the cost of their attack was clear. The Dalton farm still stood, battered but unbroken, and the townsfolk had proven they were willing to fight for their home. Jack stood in the middle of the barnyard, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he surveyed the wreckage. His body ached, and exhaustion tugged at the edges of his mind, but he couldn't afford to rest yet. The Iron Fangs might be gone for now, but he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The aftermath of the Iron Fangs' retreat left the Dalton farm in a tense, fragile quiet. The wreckage from the battle was strewn across the property, upturned dirt, shattered equipment, and the burnt remnants of a pickup truck that had been engulfed by one of Jack's improvised traps. Smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the acrid smell of gasoline and scorched metal. Despite the damage, the defenders had held their ground. But Jack Reynolds knew better than to let the temporary victory lull anyone into a false sense of security. Inside the barn, the remaining defenders gathered, their faces drawn and weary. Some leaned against walls or sat on overturned crates, clutching makeshift weapons or tending to minor wounds. Others stared blankly, the adrenaline of the fight wearing off and leaving only exhaustion. Jack stood at the center of the group, a grim figure against the dim light of the barn's lanterns. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a faint bruise that was already darkening, but he ignored it. There was no time for pain, no time for rest. We've bought ourselves some time, Jack began, his voice low but firm. But that's all it is, time. Crusher's not done. This wasn't his full force. He's testing us, wearing us down, trying to see how far we'll go to defend this place. When he comes back, and he will come back, he won't make the same mistakes. Tom, standing near the hayloft ladder, spoke up, his voice tinged with frustration. What more can we do, Jack? We've already given everything we've got just to survive this round. Look at us, we're tired, half of our traps are gone, and we barely made it through tonight. Jack nodded, understanding the fear and doubt behind his brother-in-law's words. I know you're tired. I know you're scared. But this isn't over, and we can't afford to think like it is. We've shown them we're not easy targets, but that only means they'll come back harder. If we're going to survive the next attack, we need to regroup, rethink, and be ready to outlast them. Bill Henderson, still wiping dirt from his face, stepped forward, his gruff voice cutting through the room. Jack's right. These guys don't back down, and they sure as hell don't care about playing fair. If we don't dig deeper, they'll wipe us out the next time they show up. So the question is, are we in this together or not? There was a murmur of agreement, hesitant at first, but it grew stronger as the group looked to Jack for guidance. His calm, commanding presence had kept them alive so far, and even those who doubted their chances couldn't deny that they needed him now more than ever. Jack didn't waste any time. He began issuing orders with the precision of a seasoned field commander. Tom, you're in charge of repairs. Focus on the critical points: barn doors, barricades, and anything else we can reinforce before nightfall. Bill, you're on traps. We need new ones set up to replace the ones they triggered. Claire, you're in charge of supplies. Inventory everything we've got left: food, water, ammo, medical gear, and let me know where we're short. Claire nodded, already moving to gather the younger volunteers to help her. What about you? She asked, glancing back at Jack. Jack's expression darkened slightly. I need to find out where Crusher's regrouping. If we can figure out what he's planning, we might have a shot at staying one step ahead of him. The barn fell silent at his words. Everyone knew what he meant. Jack intended to leave the safety of the farm and venture into hostile territory, alone. You're not going out there by yourself, Bill said firmly, stepping closer to Jack. You'll get yourself killed. Jack met his old friend's gaze, his tone steady. If I don't, we'll all be dead by the time Crusher's finished with us. I've done this before, Bill. I know how to stay unseen. If I don't come back by dawn, assume the worst and be ready to defend the farm. The group exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue further. They trusted Jack's judgment, even if they didn't like it. As night fell, Jack slipped away from the farm, his movements silent and calculated. He carried only what he needed: a small backpack with a few supplies, a knife sheathed at his hip, and an old revolver tucked into the waistband of his jeans. He moved through the woods with the practiced ease of a predator, his senses attuned to every sound, every shift of the wind. He followed the faint tracks left by the retreating bikers, their tire marks visible in the soft dirt of the back roads. The trail led him deeper into the woods, toward an abandoned sawmill on the outskirts of town. Jack had passed it many times during his years in Willow Creek, but now it had taken on a sinister air. Faint light glowed from inside the decrepit building, and the distant sound of laughter and revving engines confirmed his suspicions. This was where the Iron Fangs were regrouping. Jack crept closer, staying low and using the dense underbrush for cover. From his vantage point, he could see the bikers gathered around a makeshift fire pit in the mill's yard. There were more of them now, at least 30, maybe more, armed with everything from crowbars to shotguns. Crusher stood at the center of the group, barking orders and gesturing toward a map spread out on the hood of a truck. Jack strained to hear what was being said, but the distance made it difficult. He edged closer, careful not to disturb the leaves and twigs beneath his boots. As he moved, he caught snippets of the conversation. "Hit them at dawn. They won't see it coming. Burn the place to the ground. Make sure no one gets out alive." Jack's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Crusher intended to make an example of the Daltons and the entire town. The Iron Fangs were planning a full-scale assault, and they weren't holding anything back. He retreated carefully, knowing he'd heard enough. The trek back to the farm felt longer in the dark, every shadow and sound a potential threat. By the time Jack returned, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Inside the barn, the defenders were already at work, repairing the barricades and resetting traps. Claire spotted Jack first, rushing to meet him with a mix of relief and worry. "What did you find out?" she asked breathlessly. Jack's expression was grim as he gathered the group together. "They're coming at dawn," he said, "and they're bringing everything they've got. Guns, firepower, and more men than we've seen so far. This isn't just about us anymore. They want to send a message to make sure no one else in the area thinks about standing up to them." Tom swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "How the hell are we supposed to fight off something like that?" Jack looked around the group, his voice steady and resolute. "We fight smart. We've got the home field advantage, and we've got something they don't at each other. They're a gang of bullies, but we're a community. We know this land better than they ever will, and if we stick together we can outlast them." The group nodded, their fear tempered by Jack's confidence. Even those who had doubted their chances before were beginning to believe that they might just have a shot. Jack spent the next few hours fine-tuning their defenses, walking the perimeter with Bill and ensuring every trap and barricade was ready. He worked tirelessly, showing no signs of fatigue despite the strain of the past 2 days. His determination was infectious, and the defenders pushed themselves harder, knowing that their survival depended on it. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the distant rumble of engines signaled the arrival of the Iron Fangs. This time, there were no scouts, no hesitation. The gang came in force, their convoy stretching down the main road like a deadly serpent. Jack took his position at the front line, his rifle in hand and his heart steady. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying over the farm. "Whatever happens, we hold the line. For our families, for our town. Let's show them what it means to fight for something worth protecting." The battle that followed was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. The Iron Fangs came with fire and fury, but Jack and his defenders met them with courage and ingenuity. The farm became a battlefield, every trap and barricade a testament to the resilience of those who refused to back down. And through it all, Jack fought like a man possessed, every movement a reminder of why he had survived so many battles before. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for everything he held dear, and he wasn't about to let them take it away. The roar of engines echoed across the Dalton farm like a storm tearing through the horizon, signaling the Iron Fang's arrival in full force. Jack Reynolds stood at the center of the chaos, rifle in hand, his expression unyielding. The gang wasn't holding back this time. Dozens of bikers, pickup trucks bristling with weapons, and even a flat carrying a crude battering ram fashioned from steel beams. Crusher was making his message clear. This wasn't just about revenge. It was an all-out assault meant to destroy anyone who dared stand in his way. The defenders had taken their positions long before the convoy came into view. Farmers crouched behind barricades of hay bales and steel-plated tractor parts, their hands gripping hunting rifles, pitchforks, and anything else they could use as a weapon. The younger volunteers were stationed in the barn's upper levels, ready to drop makeshift explosives and heavy tools on any intruders who broke through the outer defenses. Claire was among them, a determined glint in her eyes as she moved between the defenders, passing out water and ammunition. She'd refused Jack's suggestion to stay in the farmhouse, insisting that she was as much a part of this fight as anyone else. As the gang's convoy reached the farm's perimeter, Jack raised his hand, signaling the defenders to hold their fire. The Iron Fangs slowed to a halt just beyond the main gate, their engines idling like predators waiting to pounce. Crusher stood in the back of a truck near the center of the convoy, a shotgun slung over his shoulder and a smug grin on his scarred face. "Reynolds," Crusher shouted, his voice booming over the farm. "I hope you've said your goodbyes, because this is the end of the line for you and your little crew. You think you can stand against us? You think this farm can hold? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Jack stepped forward, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he stared down the gang leader. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he called back, his voice calm and steady. "A bunch of bullies who think they can take whatever they want, because no one's ever stood up to them. Well, guess what, Crusher? You picked the wrong place and the wrong people to mess with." Crusher laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Big talk for a guy who's outnumbered and outgunned. We're gonna burn this place to the ground, Reynolds. And when we're done, we'll make sure there's nothing left for anyone to stand up for." Jack's gaze didn't waver. He had faced worse odds before, in places far more unforgiving than this. The stakes were higher now. This was his family, his community, but the principles were the same. The key to survival wasn't strength or numbers, it was strategy, discipline, and the will to fight for something worth protecting. Crusher raised his arm, signaling his men to move forward. The convoy surged toward the farm, engines screaming as the first wave of bikers charged the main gate. Jack lowered his hand, the signal the defenders had been waiting for. The traps they had spent days preparing sprang to life. The lead motorcycle hit a spike strip hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt, sending the rider flying through the air before crashing into the ground. Behind him, a pickup truck slammed into a barricade of barbed wire and steel beams, its tires shredding as the makeshift blockade held firm. Smoke grenades erupted along the perimeter, filling the air with thick clouds that blinded the attackers and forced them to slow down. The defenders opened fire. Gunshots rang out, mingling with the shouts of the Iron Fangs as they scrambled to find cover. Jack's rifle cracked with precision, each shot deliberate and devastating. He didn't waste bullets. Every pull of the trigger was a calculated move to disable vehicles, disarm attackers, or buy his team more time. But the Iron Fangs were relentless. The battering ram on the flatbed truck smashed through the outer gate, clearing a path for the bikers who followed. The defenders fell back to the next line of barricades, using the farm's natural terrain to funnel the attackers into choke points, where their numbers counted for less. Bill Henderson and his team held the left flank, setting off tripwires that triggered bursts of flame from hidden barrels of diesel fuel. On the right, Tom Dalton and a group of younger farmers used the irrigation system to flood the fields, turning the ground into a muddy quagmire that bogged down motorcycles and trucks alike. Inside the barn, Claire and her team prepared for the inevitable breach. The defenders above dropped heavy sacks of grain and tools onto the attackers below, while others used slingshots to hurl Molotov cocktails at vehicles that strayed too close. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning oil, but Claire didn't let it distract her. She kept moving, shouting encouragement to the defenders and keeping her focus on the task at hand. Outside, Jack faced off against Crusher's second-in-command, a hulking man with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. The biker swung the weapon in a wide arc, aiming for Jack's head, but Jack ducked under the blow and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him off balance. In one fluid motion, Jack grabbed the bat and wrenched it free, then used it to deliver a swift blow to the biker's knee, dropping him to the ground. Crusher watched the chaos unfold from the back of his truck, his expression shifting from smug confidence to seething rage. He hadn't expected this level of resistance, and it was clear his men were struggling to maintain their momentum. But Crusher wasn't one to back down, especially not when his reputation was on the line. "Fall back," he shouted to his men, signaling a temporary retreat. "Regroup and hit them again. Don't let up." The Iron Fangs pulled back just far enough to regroup, their engines rumbling as they prepared for another charge. Jack used the brief lull to rally his defenders, shouting orders and repositioning his team to cover the most vulnerable points. "They're coming back," he warned. "Stay sharp and stick to the plan. We've got them on the ropes, but we're not done yet." The second wave came harder and faster. Crusher himself led the charge this time, his truck plowing through the smoke and debris as the bikers followed in a tight formation. The defenders fought back with everything they had, but the sheer force of the assault began to take its toll. The outer defenses were breached, and the battle spilled into the barnyard. Jack found himself face to face with Crusher as the gang leader leapt from his truck, shotgun in hand. The two men squared off, their eyes locking in a silent battle of wills. Crusher smirked, raising the shotgun. "End of the line, Reynolds." Jack moved first. He lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the shotgun and twisting it upward just as Crusher pulled the trigger. The blast went wide, the recoil knocking Crusher off balance. Jack used the opening to deliver a series of rapid blows, driving Crusher back toward the truck. But Crusher wasn't done. He swung the shotgun like a club, catching Jack in the ribs and knocking him to the ground. Before Crusher could press the advantage, Claire appeared, wielding an iron crowbar she had grabbed from the barn. She swung it with all her strength, the metal connecting with Crusher's shoulder and sending him staggering. Jack seized the moment to regain his footing, grabbing the shotgun and tossing it aside. "You should have stayed down," he said coldly before driving his fist into Crusher's jaw, the force of the blow sending the gang leader sprawling. The remaining bikers, seeing their leader defeated, began to falter. Bill and Tom led the final push, driving the Iron Fangs back toward the perimeter. By the time the sun began to set, the battle was over. The farm was battered but still standing, and the gang had been decisively beaten. Jack stood in the center of the barnyard, breathing heavily as he surveyed the aftermath. The defenders were gathering the wounded and assessing the damage, their exhaustion tempered by a sense of triumph. Claire approached him, her face smudged with dirt but lit with a fierce pride. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah," he replied, "we did." But even as the relief settled over the farm, Jack knew this wasn't the end. Crusher and his men might be gone for now, but the fight against men like them was far from over. Still, for tonight, the Dalton farm stood as a testament to what a community could achieve when it stood together. As the final rays of sunlight bathed the Dalton farm in hues of amber and crimson, a heavy silence settled over the battlefield. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage of vehicles scattered across the barnyard, and the air still carried the acrid tang of gunpowder. The Iron Fangs were gone, retreating under the cover of their own defeat, leaving behind broken weapons, discarded gear, and the unmistakable marks of their aggression. Jack Reynolds stood near the front gate, his rifle slung over his shoulder, surveying the aftermath with the detached calm of a man who had seen far worse. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of a lingering threat. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the battle was fading now, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that threatened to pull him under. Behind him, the defenders began to emerge from their positions. Farmers, young volunteers, and townsfolk who had never held a weapon before now moved cautiously into the open, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. They had survived. Against all odds, they had stood their ground and forced the Iron Fangs to retreat. Claire was the first to approach Jack, her crowbar still in hand and her braid frayed from the chaos of the fight. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes shone with determination. "Uncle Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. "They're really gone, aren't they?" Jack turned to her, his expression softening just enough to convey a rare moment of pride. "For now," he replied. "But they'll think twice before trying something like this again. We sent a message tonight not just to Crusher, but to anyone else who thinks they can take this town without a fight." She nodded, gripping the crowbar tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "We couldn't have done it without you." Jack shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You didn't need me to fight back. You had it in you all along. All I did was show you the way." The two of them stood there for a moment, watching as the others began the slow, painstaking process of cleaning up the farm. Bill Henderson directed a group of younger volunteers to clear the debris from the barnyard, while Tom Dalton moved among the wounded, offering words of encouragement and helping where he could. Despite the destruction, there was an undeniable sense of victory in the air, a quiet but resolute pride that came from standing together against something far bigger than themselves. Inside the barn, the defenders set up a makeshift triage center. Claire joined them, her natural instincts for helping others kicking in as she tended to cuts, bruises, and sprains. Jack moved to the edge of the barn, his back against one of the reinforced walls, and sank to the ground with a heavy sigh. For the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe deeply. But even in the quiet, his mind refused to rest. He replayed every moment of the battle in his head, analyzing what had gone right, what could have gone wrong, and what they needed to do next. He knew better than to assume this was over. Men like Crusher didn't disappear easily, and even if the Iron Fangs had been defeated tonight, their connections to larger criminal networks made them a threat that wouldn't be easily erased. Tom approached, lowering himself to sit beside Jack. For a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken gratitude and understanding. Finally, Tom broke the quiet. "We owe you, Jack, all of us, if you hadn't been here." Jack opened his eyes, glancing at his brother-in-law. "You would have found a way," he said simply. "You're tougher than you think, Tom. This place, these people, they've got fight in them. They just needed someone to remind them of that." Tom nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Still, I can't help but wonder, what happens now? What if they come back?" Jack leaned his head back against the barn wall, his gaze fixed on the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Then we fight again," he said quietly. "But I don't think Crusher's in any hurry to take another shot at us. Not after the beating we just gave him." Tom hesitated, then said, "You could stay, you know, help us rebuild, maybe even settle down for good this time." Jack didn't answer right away. He had spent most of his life drifting from one fight to the next, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. The idea of staying, of finally finding a place to call home, was both tempting and foreign. "I'll help you rebuild," he said finally. "But after that, we'll see." Tom didn't press him further. He knew better than anyone that Jack's sense of duty extended far beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek. By morning, the farm was buzzing with activity. News of the Iron Fang's defeat had spread quickly, and people from neighboring farms and towns began to arrive, bringing supplies, tools, and offers of help. The barn, once a battlefield, became a hub of camaraderie and resilience as the community came together to repair the damage. Claire worked tirelessly alongside the others, her determination shining through in every task she took on. Jack watched her from a distance, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had grown so much in such a short time, transforming from a young woman caught in the crossfire into a true leader. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a convoy of police vehicles arrived at the farm. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a stern demeanor, stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene with a critical eye. He approached Jack, who stood near the barn's entrance, and tipped his hat. "Reynolds," the sheriff said gruffly. "Looks like you've been busy." Jack crossed his arms, his expression neutral. "Couldn't wait for you to show up, Sheriff. We handled it." The sheriff grunted, glancing at the wreckage and the makeshift defenses. "So I see. We've been getting reports about these bikers for months. Looks like you gave them a hell of a message." Jack didn't respond, his gaze steady. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Jack's silence before continuing. "We'll be keeping an eye out for them. If they come back, we'll handle it." Jack nodded, though he didn't place much faith in the sheriff's words. Men like Crusher thrived on slipping through the cracks of local law enforcement, and Jack knew it would take more than promises to keep the Iron Fangs at bay. As the police began to document the scene and question the defenders, Jack slipped away to the equipment shed. He opened an old, battered trunk that he had brought with him when he first returned to the farm. Inside were the remnants of his life before Willow Creek. Faded photographs, medals from his service, and a neatly folded map marked with locations that held memories too heavy to carry. He stared at the map for a long moment, his fingers tracing the lines and markings. His life had been defined by battles fought in distant places, but this fight here, on the Dalton farm, had felt different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about family, community, and standing for something bigger than himself. Claire's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Uncle Jack," she said, stepping into the shed. "We're about to start rebuilding the barn. Thought you might want to help." Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll be there." As he followed her back to the barn, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. The Dalton farm had weathered the storm, and while the scars of the battle would remain, so too would the strength it had forged. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a place where he could stay.